In a system where even pain must be authorized, the silent disappearance of thousands of messages following the death of a young actor revealed a disturbing truth that few dared to speak aloud. Even mourning can become a prohibited act. What for any society should be a natural space for compassion was transformed into a meticulous operation that erased words, images, and gestures of humanity with an almost mechanical speed, as if an immense shadow had descended upon every digital corner to dissipate not only the traces of a life, but the very possibility of feeling. While users tried to understand what had happened, the bewilderment grew at the pace of posts disappearing before they could generate dialogue. Suddenly, emotion remained suspended, frozen in a silence that was not the fruit of calm, but of control. However, that impeccably polished surface could not hide the questions emerging beneath the dull glow of the screens. What kind of structure fears memory so much that it decides to erase it even before it can settle in the heart of the public? What truth can be so disturbing that a collective farewell is considered risky in an environment marked by glamour and the apparent normality of show business? But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms really drive this crisis? We will analyze every detail, from the initial errors to the irreversible damage, to see how the world of entertainment functions and how an icon is redefined. The case of Menglong, an actor whose image had been carefully associated with serenity and discipline, acquired an unexpected nuance when his death triggered the deepest digital purge in contemporary Chinese entertainment. At first glance, the contradictions seemed insurmountable. The massive disappearance of content did not correspond to the figure of a discreet performer, a stranger to scandals whose trajectory had been built upon silent constancy rather than notoriety. The sensation of emptiness that followed that accelerated elimination caused the audience to face a painful paradox. It was not just the loss that generated disquiet, but the impossibility of processing it. In that lapse, social media transformed into a territory where emotion could not develop naturally, a space where spontaneity was relegated before the precision of a mechanism, deciding what should remain standing and what should disappear without a trace. Between the lines, an uncomfortable understanding began to emerge. Perhaps the story was not limited to the passing of a young actor, but pointed to a deeper tension between individuals wishing to express their humanity and structures that police every emotional nuance circulating in the public sphere. What was at stake from that instant was not solely the memory of Menglong, but the revelation of a dynamic in which silence could become both a tool and a warning. From this initial crack, the need to descend into the hidden layers of the industry became inevitable, marking the beginning of a search that would not only examine the immediate facts, but also the forces shaping, with almost surgical precision, the life and perception of those inhabiting the heart of the spectacle. As the surface of the imposed silence began to spread, it became evident that the story could not be understood without returning to the origin, to the territory where Menglong's youthful ambition met a rigid system that molded artistic life with a precision exceeding any professional standard. Before his name became a reference point for international debate, there existed a young man whose trajectory seemed to follow the usual course of those who, from distant provinces, dreamed of reaching a place in the major studios. However, the luminous appearance projected by television dramas hid a denser gear mechanism, one that regulated everything from schedules to emotions, outlining a minimal margin for authentic expression. The industry demanded absolute discipline, as if visibility were a privilege that had to be paid for by renouncing spontaneity and rest. From day one, Menglong understood that this universe functioned according to a tacit contract in which every gesture was observed, every word was calibrated, and every silence had a meaning interpreted beyond its original intention. His origins in Jiangsu and his upbringing in Xinjiang molded a serene temperament that contrasted deeply with the harshness of the professional environment he found upon entering the industry. Colleagues who shared those early projects with him remembered the thoroughness with which he studied every scene, adjusting small inflections, modulating breaths, building emotions that did not need stridency to reach the viewer. This ability to transmit intensity through subtlety quickly caught the attention of casting directors, who saw in that quiet presence a type of talent capable of sustaining a long-running drama. However, what seemed to many a luminous promise would become, over time, a source of silent vulnerability. The labor structure that was supposed to propel him toward recognition ended up eroding, little by little, the margins that allowed him to exist as an individual beyond the character. The contracts regulating his activity were designed to guarantee efficiency, but their fine print imposed a level of control surpassing the strictly professional. Workdays extending for 16 hours, absence of holidays, tacit prohibition of rejecting assigned projects, limitations on personal relationships, and constant supervision of behavior in public spaces configured an environment where autonomy was reduced to an almost symbolic minimum. The logic of this system started from an apparently simple premise. The image had to remain intact, free of cracks that could generate uncertainty in the audience. However, that premise turned daily life into an exercise of internal resistance. Artists learned from very early on that any manifestation of fatigue could be interpreted as a lack of commitment, and that the expression of discomfort was equivalent to a deviation from the emotional script expected of them. With the passage of time, changes in his appearance began to become perceptible. Although he maintained his kind attitude, his movements became slower, and his gaze acquired a caution that was not present in his early years. Several stylists mentioned marks on his face and neck, always covered with makeup before the cameras began to roll. The origin of those signs remained wrapped in prudent silence. In that environment, asking questions could have consequences, and self-censorship became a survival tool almost as necessary as any acting skill. In public interviews, Menglong resorted to metaphors to describe his relationship with fame. One of his most cited phrases, "The light is heavy," initially went unnoticed, interpreted as a poetic reflection on the demands of work. Over time, that phrase acquired a revealing nuance. Those who knew him understood that this heaviness did not refer to superficial tiredness, but to a sustained emotional pressure, a sensation of burden, forcing him to distance himself from what he cherished, so as not to compromise the image he had to keep intact. This distancing inevitably affected his personal life. Although he spoke with affection about his family in some live broadcasts, the possibility of sharing moments with them was reduced due to the restrictions imposed by the industry. To protect his loved ones from any possible repercussions, he opted to maintain a prudent distance, reserving his emotions for spaces where surveillance did not reach. That decision did not respond to indifference, but to the responsibility of preventing the weight of his career from affecting those who did not belong to the world of show business. The absence of close emotional support, combined with the pace of work, configured a constant tension that found no visible outlet. The progressive increase of his presence on screen brought with it a more complex network of commitments. Rejecting an advertising campaign could be interpreted as a gesture of disobedience. Expressing fatigue could be considered a threat to the continuity of the public image. According to specialists in artistic management, the system fostered a culture where lack of rest was viewed as proof of professionalism. In this context, the line between dedication and extreme sacrifice blurred rapidly, creating an emotional scenario where strength was confused with the capacity to endure in silence. The accumulation of these demands began to mold an internal landscape marked by unexpressed tensions. His contained conduct, often interpreted as natural shyness, also reflected a strategy to avoid internal conflicts within the agency. Silence operated as a shield, allowing him to advance without drawing attention to the difficulties he faced. But that very silence increasingly reduced the space available to ask for help or share concerns. Emotional containment transformed into a way of life that accompanied him even in his moments of greatest public visibility. Observing this set of factors, it is understandable that his story resonated with such force after his passing. The contradiction between the public image of a disciplined young man and the oppressive environment in which he worked raised difficult questions about the mechanisms structuring artistic life. For many admirers, the tragedy resided not only in his death, but in the impossibility of having expressed the difficulties he was going through. That light he described as heavy revealed itself over time as a metaphor for a system demanding constant shine even when the wear and tear was evident. There, in that tension between appearance and reality, lay the first key to understanding why his story generated such a persistent echo in the heart of the public. What do you think of this? Comment amen below so we can continue with the unfinished stories. The morning the news of Yu Menglong's passing spread, social media began to transform into an unpredictable stage where emotion, far from expanding naturally, found itself trapped in an elimination process advancing with almost mechanical speed. What initially seemed like the public's spontaneous reaction to the death of a beloved actor very soon acquired a disturbing nuance. Farewell messages vanished within seconds of being published, as if an invisible force were filtering every gesture of humanity before it could take root. The initial impression that it was a technical glitch blurred quickly. Users observed that the disappearance repeated with a precision that could not be attributed to chance. It was a pattern, a sequence executed with a rhythm so constant that the imposed silence began to acquire shape and depth. As the hours advanced, the magnitude of the operation was laid bare. Even the accounts of established celebrities, accustomed to exercising considerable influence in the digital environment, lost messages with the same speed as the anonymous public. Actresses like Yang Mi and Dilraba Dilmurat, who had attempted to express their condolences, saw their posts withdrawn before generating significant interaction. The elimination reached both high-profile figures and common followers without any distinction. Platforms issued brief statements appealing to respect for privacy and the need to avoid unverified rumors. However, those declarations, far from reassuring the public, reinforced the sensation that this was a protocol designed to deactivate any type of emotional resonance. The emotional impact for those following the actor's career was immediate. The impossibility of sharing grief increased the feeling of emptiness, a sensation deriving not solely from the loss, but from the absence of a space to process it. Social networks, habitually flooded with spontaneous messages, appeared clean, as if nothing had happened. That artificial cleanliness generated a disturbing contrast with the intensity of the accumulated pain. Some users described the experience as a sort of simultaneous memory wipe, an attempt to neutralize even the possibility of remembering. The lack of explanations encouraged confusion and fed the perception that the tragedy was being contained in a way that transcended simple information management. In the midst of that climate of bewilderment, an event further altered the general tension. Presenter Liu Wei published a screenshot of a conversation with makeup artist Song Si, a close friend of Yu Menglong. Although the content appeared fleetingly, some fragments revealed a complex emotional state. The phrase that resonated most was "the world destroyed him," a statement insinuating prolonged suffering. The post expanded rapidly and reached thousands of reactions before disappearing. Shortly after, Liu Wei's account ceased to be accessible. That abrupt closure and the hasty elimination of evidence reinforced the impression that digital authorities were intervening not only to manage information, but also to delimit the emotional scope of the tragedy. What had begun as collective mourning was now converting into a terrain where every word could disappear before consolidating as public thought. User reaction was not homogeneous. A sector of the public interpreted the restrictions as a measure oriented toward preventing speculations that could aggravate the situation. They maintained that an environment saturated with rumors would harm both the family and the actor's reputation. Another sector, however, perceived the operation as an attempt to control the narrative and prevent the tragedy from leading to broader questioning of the industry's structural conditions. This division opened a space for intense debate where discussions did not center exclusively on the figure of Yu Menglong, but on the very nature of the system regulating collective emotions. Instead of dissipating tension, the imposed silence amplified it, fostering the search for hidden meanings in every absence, in every message withdrawn without explanation. The international reaction added an additional layer of complexity. Users from different countries began to collect, translate, and disseminate the screenshots that had been eliminated in the original environment. Platforms like Reddit, TikTok, and X became repositories where fragments escaping initial control were stored. The echo of the news expanded with unexpected speed, transforming an apparently local event into a global analysis of the relationship between entertainment and information control. Paradoxically, the suppression of content did not reduce attention but multiplied it. The more they tried to erase, the more interest the story generated, and more people joined the search for answers. The dynamic acquired an almost symbolic tone. Memory, far from disappearing, found new routes to endure. The emotional and media repercussion began to directly affect the industry's functioning. Already planned programs postponed recordings, interviews were cancelled, and those artists who planned to make public appearances opted for a prudent retreat. Communication agencies disseminated statements that, although drafted with different nuances, shared a similar message: caution, discretionist, and suspension of any comment related to the case. The uniformity of that tone reinforced the perception that the sector was following a common directive, destined to contain any deviation from the official framework. Several producers described the moment as a perfect storm, a combination of human tragedy and digital control that had generated an environment where every movement had to be calibrated with extreme care. The foreign press approached the phenomenon from a more analytical perspective. Specialists in cultural politics interpreted the massive deletion as a signal of the conflict existing between the idealized image the country wished to project and the real complexity of its media structure. According to these analyses, the operation sought not only to manage a delicate event, but also to prevent the tragedy from triggering questions regarding labor conditions, mental health, and the hierarchy defining the internal functioning of the entertainment industry. In that reading, the sudden disappearance of content revealed the fragility of a system that, to remain firm, needed to ensure that no element disturbed the appearance of stability. Meanwhile, Menglong's admirers faced an emotional dilemma. On one hand, they wished to respect the family's privacy. On the other, they felt the imperious need to preserve his memory in a space that seemed determined to erase any sign. This tension gave rise to new forms of expression seeking to evade algorithmic scrutiny. Instead of writing names, users shared symbolic images, abstract phrases, or references that only those following the case could identify. Those gestures, though discreet, functioned as small islands of memory within an ocean of restrictions, demonstrating that even in a heavily regulated environment, the collective will find modes of emotional affirmation. The struggle to remember did not manifest with shouts, but with a silent persistence extending beyond digital borders. At this point, the mourning began to reveal a truth not always formulated explicitly. When a community perceives that a story is being silenced, the need to understand intensifies. Every deleted message became an incentive to investigate further, to collect fragments, to reconstruct that which was attempted to be faded out. The tragedy did not dilute in the silence. It transformed into a force pushing users to explore the hidden layers of a system that seemed to fear even emotional resonance. It was that impulse, born of bewilderment and sustained by empathy, that prepared the way toward the turning point that would emerge shortly after and change the dimension of the case forever. The silence that followed the disappearance of the messages did not bring the serenity some expected. On the contrary, it generated an emotional density that settled over those who had accompanied Menglong's career since his first roles. The absence of verifiable information amplified the impression that the mourning had been displaced to an uncertain territory where every question had to be formulated with caution. The family, deeply affected, opted to shelter in a respectful silence that increased the sensation of emptiness. In the studios, conversations disappeared little by little, replaced by prudent glances revealing concern, but also a latent fear of repercussions. The atmosphere filled with a tense stillness that seemed to extend without limit. It was the darkest hour of the story, an instant in which the tragedy seemed suspended in a space where memory was fragile and the tale depended on decisions not explained openly. In that climate of opacity, many admirers began to describe a sense of powerlessness that intensified as the days passed. The impossibility of accessing reliable sources left the public trapped between the desire to understand and the tacit obligation not to interrogate too much. Every attempt at reconstruction faced the deliberate absence of data. The tragedy, instead of resolving through clarity, seemed to advance toward a zone where what could not be said weighed more than any declaration. Memory, reduced to scattered fragments, sought a place to secure itself, but found only the cold surface of a system privileging narrative stability over emotional relief. It was at that point where uncertainty reached an almost suffocating dimension, feeding the perception that silence was not a simple gesture of caution, but an encirclement tightening around an incomplete story. When the environment reached that level of extreme containment, an unexpected fact occurred that modified the dynamics of the silence. A brief video recorded during a break in the filming of one of his productions began to circulate on an international platform. It was not a dramatic scene or confidential material. It was a simple capture showing Menglong sitting near the technical crew while exchanging a serene smile with a person off camera. The image radiated a quotidian humanity, contrasting deeply with the oppressive climate dominating the narrative. There, in that minimal gesture, seemed to reside a light that no elimination process could dissipate. Users who saw the clip responded with a mixture of tenderness and revelation, as if that fragment returned to the world an essential part of his presence that had remained trapped between restrictions. The diffusion of the video expanded with a speed exceeding any expectation. In a matter of hours, it crossed digital and cultural borders, reaching communities unaware of the story in detail, but who immediately recognized the authenticity contained in that smile. What emerged then was not a debate on the tragedy, nor a discussion on the initial speculations. It was a deeply human reaction to the evidence that, beyond any control structure, existed an individual who had left a genuine mark on those who admired him. The most repeated comment did not center on theories, but on the calm his expression radiated. From that instant, collective perception experienced a significant turn. The story ceased to be a case limited to the industrial sphere, to transform into a reflection on the need to preserve that which grants meaning to human experience. The effect of this clip began to manifest within the industry as well. Some artists discreetly shared works alluding to the persistence of light and the difficulty of silencing an authentic emotion. Although these expressions were wrapped in metaphors, those who followed them identified in them an effort to express solidarity without openly challenging the norms regulating public activity. That symbolic language functioned as a bridge between private grief and the collective need to remember. The gesture, though contained, revealed that the emotional impact had reached a dimension no control mechanism could completely neutralize. As the video circulated, a phenomenon some analysts termed expanded memory was strengthened. This concept referred to the way the actor's memory extended through fragments escaping institutional frameworks. Saved photographs, translated comments, re-uploaded videos, all contributed to an effective reconstruction not dependent on official records. This movement, far from constituting an explicit challenge, expressed a deeply human impulse, the will to preserve the dignity of a life that seemed to have vanished under a silencing mechanism. The emotional impact of the clip was so profound that many users began to speak of a silent presence. The expression described the way the actor's memory continued influencing conversations without the need for direct words. Silence, in that context, did not represent absence, but a space where the public reconstructed the story from their own experience. Memory became an act of cultural resistance, questioning the idea that a narrative could be completely administered from a hierarchical structure. What had begun as a spontaneous gesture transformed into a collective affirmation regarding the importance of remembering even when open expression was restricted. The expansion of the case introduced a deeper reflection on the relationship between information control and collective emotions. Several specialists pointed out that the suppression of content can temporarily limit the diffusion of certain elements, but cannot prevent people from interpreting that absence as a significant clue. In fact, the more the narrative was attempted to be channeled toward a point of absolute stillness, the greater the public's impulse to recover the scattered fragments and reconstruct them into a coherent story. Social memory, instead of extinguishing, acquired an unexpected autonomy, revealing the fragility of any system attempting to mold it rigidly. With the passage of time, collective mourning transformed into a shared message. It did not arise from slogans or public speeches, but from a common conviction about the need to conserve what had touched so many people. This evolution was not limited to the figure of the actor. It opened a broader reflection on the value individual lives acquire in contexts where emotional expression can be regulated. Menglong's story ceased to belong solely to the realm of entertainment. It began to symbolize the persistence of memory in the face of instability, a reminder that human dignity expresses itself often in the will to remember even when silence seems to impose itself as the norm. When a system fears even a memory, how fragile is its power really? With the passage of time, Menglong's story ceased to be interpreted solely from personal tragedy to become a broader framework where memory, human vulnerability, and the tensions emerging when a system attempts to administer even the most intimate emotions converged. What began as a series of digital restrictions evolved into a collective reflection on the value of remembering. The public understood that an artist's presence does not reside solely on stages or in audience figures, but in the authenticity they transmit and the emotional connection established with those observing from a distance. In Menglong's case, that authenticity persisted beyond any attempt at silencing. It survived in discreet gestures, in rescued fragments, and in the conviction of those who refused to accept that a life could fade without leaving a trace. The reaction arising around his figure revealed that memory can expand even when material records disappear. Every saved photograph, every translated comment, and every re-edited video constituted spontaneous forms of resistance seeking not confrontation, but to preserve the dignity of a story that had touched thousands of people. In this process, mourning ceased to be an individual act to transform into a shared space, where empathy prevailed over imposed silence. The community understood that remembering is not a passive gesture. It is an affirmation of humanity, a way of sustaining what is considered valuable even when circumstances seem to push toward oblivion. Analysts following the evolution of the case pointed out that the story offered a crucial lesson on the limits of information control. While a system can manage the visibility of certain content, it cannot regulate the emotional interpretation arising in those who observe it. The very absence of information becomes a clue, an impulse to investigate and reconstruct that which is hidden. Collective memory operates with an autonomy overflowing any administrative mechanism. That autonomy, silent but persistent, constitutes the foundation upon which societies preserve their most significant tales. From this understanding, the figure of Menglong began to symbolize something transcending his artistic trajectory. It represented the persistence of light in an environment where darkness seemed to impose itself as the norm. It also represented the possibility that emotional truth would find a way despite restrictions. His memory became integrated into a broader debate on the importance of protecting the space where human emotions are expressed, a space belonging to no institution, but to those feeling the need to grant meaning to their experiences. The echo of his story invites one to think about the future. How will cultural expressions evolve in a context where memory can be so vulnerable and, at the same time, so resistant? Perhaps new forms of dialogue will emerge, recognizing these tensions and allowing those working in highly regulated industries to find a greater margin to express their concerns. Perhaps the capacity to remember will become an even more appreciated value in a world where information circulates and disappears with the same speed. In any case, the intention is not to offer definitive certainties, but to open a reflection on the shared responsibility of preserving that which possesses human value. If you have reached this point, perhaps you wish to delve deeper into some aspect of this story or explore other cases where memory and silence intertwine in a similar way. I will be here to continue the conversation and accompany you in any direction you want to follow.